November 22nd marked the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's assassination. Coming up, more from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh and a conference disputing the U.S. government's official findings on JFK's murder. Next, Robert Tenenbaum, the former Deputy Chief Counsel of the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations. He gives his analysis of the government's conduct in the investigation of President Kennedy's death. He's followed by James Lesser, president of the Assassination Archives and Research Center, who gives his assessment of the job done by the Assassination Records Review Board, which issued its final report in 1998. This is 2 Hours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ben. And thank you for all attending. I just wanted to, by way of introductory remarks, sort of tie some things up, because Joan Mellon gave a great talk this morning, and she talked about how the president has sort of surrendered to the CIA, which JFK did not do. JFK was going to appoint Bobby Kennedy as head of the CIA and reform it, which was a major issue in this whole investigation. But then last night, a gentleman from the Boston Globe talked about how the media covers matters of national security. And between the two, Joan, of course, is right. If the media were covering national security, and let me put it another way, if all of the researchers who you've heard, all of the authorities, were to focus on getting the truth today, how much better off would our society be? Benghazi as a very quick example. Administration knew in real time what was happening on September 11, 2012, which was a Tuesday. They then didn't tell us the truth. They talked about it being a spontaneous demonstration as a result of a video which not too many people ever saw. And then the president, with the Secretary of State, 3 days later at Andrews Air Force Base, with the parents of the deceased, who were flag-draped in coffins, looked at them eye to eye, ear to ear, nose to nose, and said, we're going to get the people responsible who made this video. And so the question arises, which is Shakespearean, and that is, to express an unfelt sorrow is the office which the false man does easy. So again, when we talk about the media allegedly covering national security, I would suggest they would start with the issues today, because if the IRS is indeed focusing on conservative groups and they get away with it, tomorrow there'll be liberal groups, and in a month there'll be independents, and there'll be nowhere to hide. And that aspect I mentioned because it's so much part of the investigation, what the ethics are of it, and how do you conduct an investigation, regardless where you may be. As an assistant DA, I will tell you, in Manhattan, I worked in an apolitical office, if you can believe that. My boss was Frank Hogan, and he was a lifelong Democrat, but always had a liberal party. That's the party of David Dubinsky of the International Lady Garment Workers. John Lindsay ran as a liberal and was elected mayor. The Conservative Party and the Republican Party. He didn't know the political affiliations. And so the only thing that we were concerned about was a search for truth. And if the major issue that we were always concerned about was to exonerate the unjustly accused. And in the kind of trials, high-profile trials that I had, lasting 5 months, 10 months, major murder cases, I spent a good part of the trial, particularly in summation, in debunking the big lie, defense. There's an old saw around the court, and it goes something like this. If you have a weak case on the facts, try the law. If you have a weak case on the law, try the facts. If you have a weak case on the law and the facts, you try the DA. When I came to Washington, I realized, after investigating the case and coming up with some very, very important evidence, I now had the big lie offense to deal with that was pursued by the government, that Oswald acted alone without foreign intervention. I can tell you from my experiences having tried several hundred cases to verdict and being responsible for thousands of cases as head of the criminal courts and running the Homicide Bureau, that I don't believe there's any courtroom in America where Oswald would have been convicted on the evidence that was presented before the Warren Commission. I also wanted to make mention of my dear friend Mark Lane. I was very honored when he asked me to do an introduction to his book, which is entitled The Last Word. And I wish you'd all read it. Isn't that nice that I could tell you to read other authors? And the amazing thing about Mark Lane is that I knew of Mark Lane when I was in the DA's office. When he was an assemblyman, I was in high school. And when I came into the DA's office right out of law school from Berkeley, college and law school at Berkeley, that was pre-revolutionary Berkeley, revolutionary Berkeley, and post-revolutionary Berkeley. Mark Lane was the scourge of DAs. And I try to explain to everybody that you want to try cases against the very best defense attorneys. Why? Because it's not about the win. It's about ensuring that in the case, justice is done, and you never want to win a case, have it reversed because of some faulty error that never should have been made. And Mark Lane, you should pray that you try a case against Mark Lane, who will press the government so that the evidence ultimately is trustworthy and relevant, and no appellate court will reverse the case from the trial record. When and the other book that I was asked to do an introduction to was Dr. Crenshaw's book, which they have now retitled, I understand. But I do want to leave you with this thought about that. Dr. Charles Crenshaw was in Trauma Room 1, as most of you may know, when the president's body was wheeled in to Parkland Hospital. Now, Dr. Crenshaw is a renowned trauma surgeon. And Dr. Crenshaw indicated that the wounds came from the front and the right side. This is before there was a one-bullet theory. This is before there was a Warren Commission. And there was that kind of evidence that I thought would be very important to present to the committee, because if people want to know, when people say the Warren Commission didn't do a fair and honest job, you have to ask them, why wasn't Crenshaw called before the Warren Commission? That's what you would, if you had the theory, which they did regrettably, that is to say the Warren Commission worked from conclusion backwards. In the course of conducting investigations, the facts take you to conclusion. The evidence, legally admissible evidence, take you to conclusion. Warren Commission did exactly the reverse. And that's exactly what should not happen, because as I was telling our committee members, we are not a grand jury. And we want to present all sides. So if you work from conclusion back, the Warren Commission, particularly with Earl Warren, formerly DA of Alameda County, Attorney General of California, Governor of California, he knows about exculpatory evidence. He's responsible for Brady v. Maryland. And that exculpatory evidence is any evidence that would show that the accused is not guilty. That's a serious burden on prosecutors. It's not something you wait to give them at the last second, 10 seconds before summation. You give it at the earliest opportunity, because we want to exonerate the unjustly accused. There's a big inventory in criminal justice. You don't have to worry that you have no work to do. So the whole Charles Crenshaw thing, to me, is a prime example. And I remember very distinctly when I first came to Washington, and I'm a Johnny-come-lately to all this, because the only book that I ever read prior to going to Washington was Mark Lane's book, only because I knew of Mark Lane. And that was 1966 rush to judgment. So the Crenshaw piece, though, which was very revealing to me, was a diagram he made in circular fashion indicating that the back of the president's head was blown out. And various people signed on to that. And yet it was ignored. And it was ignored by the Warren Commission and ignored by the media. Now, when I went to Washington, I was very impressed by some of the people who were there. And I think that the most impressive person I met in Washington, who I literally drove crazy, having him show me film after film, frame by frame, working around the clock to catch up, was Robert Groden. And are you here, Robert Groden? Well, let's give him a round of applause for the work that he's done in this case. I just want you to keep in mind when I talk about the ethics of investigation that my background out of law school, the only reason I went to law school was to work in the office of District Attorney Frank Hogan and to try the worst of the worst and work my way up, ultimately to be selected to get into the Homicide Bureau, which is the major leagues of this whole business. And when I met Bob Groden, he got all of these pieces together. And I had worked with the very best detectives in the city of New York. And I wish I had, in retrospect, Gary Aguilar and Joan Mellon on my staff, and we would have ended corruption in New York City, given their expertise and diligence and comprehensive and thorough investigation. And Groden, the same thing. And we worked and worked, and finally it sunk in about all the different aspects of all this. But there was, what was critical in my training was that this was a search for truth under the rules of evidence. And that there is no Republican, there's no Democrat way to investigate a case. And there's no liberal or conservative way to evaluate evidence. So I also, before I get into what really happened in Washington, which was shocking to me, because I'm just a Jewish kid who grew up in Brooklyn and played ball and drove my way out to Berkeley and lived with traditional American values. And part of those values, which was a very big part of JFK, we've heard a lot about speculation about what he may have done or may not have done, but we know what he said. And it had to do with American exceptionalism. It's not some arrogant superiority concept. What it is a moral and spiritual way of life. And it came to America with the Puritans, who saw themselves as the children of Israel in the Old Testament, who fled oppression, who took a perilous journey across the vast ocean, and who believed that they came to the promised land and that we would be judged. They would be judged as moral beings. And so it was John Winthrop in about 1630, who was the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who said, "We are this city on the hill." It wasn't Ronald Reagan. We have a tendency to believe as soon as a new president is elected, history starts on that date. But his people were smart enough at least to go back in time and recognize that we are the city on the hill. And the conflict in America has always been, and continues to be, how do we act in concert with the mind of America? And that's where the reform comes in, and that's why we need a chief executive who's completely independent, like JFK, who got burnt in the Bay of Pigs, recognized after he dismissed Dulles that he had to revamp this whole intelligence apparatus, because what the bottom line is, which we clearly learned and knew basically before we started, but we learned from the evidence, that the executive intelligence agencies define national interest. And that the elective process is a temporary thing, isn't it? Some people are elected to Congress for 2 years, the Senate for 6, the President for 8, maybe. But they're there to keep and define and maintain what they find is our national interest. If there's a conflict between the President and the Executive Intelligence Agency, then you have this tension. And to show you how hard we worked at the committee, I was called in one day by Bob Grodin's assistants, and they said, you have to see this film, it's very important. And I went into the room, and it wasn't a video room, it was just a room. And there was a screen, and the camera went on. And there was JFK. It was a 1960 West Virginia primary. And he was dressed there in his Brooks Brothers suit. He had on cashmere muffler and coat, his wingtip shoes. And it was a real moment to show that he was a people's person, not just the junior senator from Massachusetts who was the son of a rich man. And so he was greeting the coal miners. And it had just rained, and it was drizzling, and he was on the mud flats, and he was shaking hands with the coal miners in anticipation of this West Virginia primary that was conducted by Matt Reese, who was his campaign person then, who I met when I ran my boss's last campaign while I still was trying murder cases, only working after 6 o'clock at night. And one of the coal miners stopped right in front of JFK, and he said, as Kennedy extended his hand, he said, "Senator, I understand you haven't worked a day in your life." And Kennedy immediately glanced to see if anybody heard that, and everybody in the media had stopped. Kennedy looked at him and said, "I guess you can say that's true." To which the coal miner responded, "Senator, I want to tell you something. You're not missing a goddamn thing." Now, the reason I mention American exceptionalism, and the part of American exceptionalism, is we try to institutionalize virtue, and we recognize that evil exists. It has to be confronted and defeated. And the reason I mention that to you is not only to tell you where I'm coming from, and you'll evaluate what I have to say about what happened at the committee, but JFK said it in his inaugural address, and I urge you to read it. Because what he said was he took up all of the Puritan exceptionalist claims. He talked about how the rights of individuals come from the hand of God and not from legislative or executive fiat. He talked about how this torch is going to be passed and it will light up the universe. He talked always in moral terms. And he talked about that we will be doing God's work here. And that's when he went into that famous refrain of, "We will bear any burden, endure any hardship, and make any sacrifice to assure that the blessings of liberty are here at home and around the world." That was the JFK that I knew. And when he wrote out that last line of his last speech that he never gave in Dallas, he said, "Except the Lord from the city, and the watchman waketh but in vain." With that, and my own background, Patty and I went to Washington. And I'm reminded of a story that Mark Lane told me, that when, having read all this in preparation before I went down to Washington, that, and by the way, I have to confess, if my boss Frank Hogan were alive, I never would have gone to Washington. I would have stayed in the DA's office, and I didn't seek this job. I was asked to come down to Washington, and after listening to the committee members who spoke to me, I said, "Look, don't hire me." And they said, "Why?" I said, "Because there's I can't compromise on finding the truth. I'm not an expert at all. I just read one book. I'm a non-entity here. But if we find that Oswald did it, and he did it alone, we'll say it. If we find otherwise, we're going to have to say it. I don't know you're built to do that. After all, the Congress is geared to make compromise. As a matter of fact, what they do today, if they compromise at all, is they recover a ball beyond the line of scrimmage. They call that progress. So they said, no, whatever it is, based upon the investigation, we will do. Unfortunately, that was an insincere comment, as we will now learn. The first time, during the first week when I was in Washington, as I said, I'm reminded of this Mark Lane story that I heard during this first week. about him, not from him, because I hadn't met him yet. And that was that in September, the executive committee, there was an executive committee report from the Warren Commission that laid out its conclusions, but there was no evidence to support it. In November, the 26 volumes came down. And it was a helter-skelter. I just said that, helter-skelter, presentation. And it wasn't organized with respect to this volume has ballistics and other evidence, medical and other witnesses at Grassy Knoll or wherever, what the Secret Service were doing and so on and so forth, and why the Mafia had nothing to do with it, or Lyndon Johnson, and these are the reasons why. That's what one would expect from this whole thing. Instead, it was just thrown together. And Anthony Lewis, who Joan mentioned, was waiting online with none other than the infamous Mark Lane. And they got the 26 volumes in the afternoon. And the next day in the New York Times, Anthony Lewis had an op-ed piece saying, well, here it is. The evidence now supports the executive committee, the executive report from the Warren Commission. And Mark Lane wrote him a letter and said, it's going to take me about 1.5 years to read all this material. How is it that you were able to do it overnight? Mark Lane still hasn't heard from him because he probably hasn't finished the letter. So I get called after hearing these stories about Mark, and again, you can't say enough about him because he was responsible for the committee to take off. He was also responsible, as I will indicate, by doing great work with respect to the Freedom of Information Act. He's like Menuhin is to the violin. Both of them get out of their instruments things that nobody is capable of doing. And the committee then, that is to say my experience with the committee, was terminated when I resigned, and I will tell you how that happened. The first week there, Senator Schweiker, Richard Schweiker, asked me to meet with him in his office. I came with my chief investigator, Cliff Fenton, who was a detective, grew up in Harlem, who had worked with me, a top detective in New York City, and there are about 9,000 detectives on the NYPD. And Cliff I took down as the chief investigator. We went to see Senator Schweiker. I had just read that report, the executive committee responses to the assassinations of Martin Luther King and President Kennedy, which is about 90 pages. I mean, every American should read that. And from the church committee. And he told me he has a file for me. And it was put together by Gayton Fonzie. Gayton Fonzie and Bob Grodin were two of the most outstanding people, in my judgment, who worked in this committee. And Gayton, yeah, it's well-deserved. Gayton Fonzie was incredible. And again, having investigated all these murder cases and so on, I wished I had Gayton in the DA's office in Manhattan. But in any event, it was a file that he had put together, and it was handed to me by Senator Schweiker, and he said, you're going to get stonewalled by the CIA. And I believe that the CIA somehow was involved in this assassination. Well, that was pretty chilling commentary coming from a United States senator. You see, I went to PS 238. I didn't go to a fancy in Brooklyn, and then public high school, and then I chose to go to a public university. And what I learned was that we have a tripartite, co-equal branch system of government. And the United States Senate, he told me, couldn't get documents from an executive intelligence agency. I found that absolutely incredible. Well, that night, Cliff came home to the house that Patty and I were living in, and we went down into the rented house in, near on Wisconsin Avenue near American University, and we went into this finished-off basement office. And we finished reading this file at about 4 o'clock in the morning. It was all about anti-Castro Cuban activity, about CIA involvement with the anti-Castro Cubans, about Clinton, Louisiana, and everything you said is 100% true. As a matter of fact, what you didn't mention, or I didn't hear, and I'm accused of not being able to hear these days, was that I found out that, as Mark Lane indicated, there was more than one Air Force. Well, there was more than Army, Navy, Air Force. There was CIA Army who had film of various mercenaries who were a private army for the CIA. But it was about Anthony Vesciano, who some of you may know, who was hired to kill Castro and all these kinds of nefarious activities. And when we finished, I escorted Detective Fenton to the door. Some of you who read my novels will know him as Clay Fulton. And for the first time, in all the cases we've been involved in, brutal murder cases, with vicious, depraved killers who enjoyed the killing, regrettably, he hesitated as he went through the door. And he was glancing around, and he turned to me and he said the following: "Tanny, we're way over our head here, and there's no Hogan to protect you. Go home, get some sleep. I'll see you in the morning." Back I went to see Grodin and more film. Thereafter, the following occurred. It dawned on me from the evidence we had. We were coming across a person whose name was Maurice Bishop. But there was no file on Maurice Bishop. And then I realized from the evidence that Maurice Bishop was David Phillips, who was in charge of Western Hemispheric operations for the CIA. He was the third person in command. He was right below Richard Helms. And I subpoenaed him to come to the committee. I should tell you, Cliff Fenton served a subpoena on George de Mohrenschildt in West Palm Beach, and that was the very day that he allegedly killed himself. So Phillips was served. He came to the committee in executive session, and I asked him the following. But before I tell you that, I want you to know the following. On Thursdays, I believe it was, I had office hours for the public from noon until however long it took. And people would come in. I wanted the pro-Warren Commission people and the anti-Warren Commission people to have an opportunity. Having particularly read all these books, some of which were absolutely through the roof outstanding. Sylvia Marr comes to mind as just one, but there were many, many, many. But I was very impressed with the historiography and the documentation and the painstaking efforts that people made. And a gentleman comes in, and there was no time, and on my own dime, I had coffee and donuts for people, and they were lined up. And in walks this gentleman who was introduced to me, Mark Lane. The first time I had ever seen him in the flesh. And he had striking dark hair. I can testify to that. And he walked in, and I get up to greet him, and he hands me an envelope. And he walks out. I said, "Wait a minute, where are you going? Don't you want to have a seat and tell me what's in the envelope?" He said, "No, I know all about you. I know you'll do the right thing." And he left. Well, I opened up that envelope, and the following occurred. Seated opposite me at the table, at this long table, rectangular, was David Phillips. He appeared as though he had just walked out of a coffin. He was ashen, thin, three-piece suit, very erect. He sat down. He was sworn in. The stenographer was to my left. And he was where the gentleman is, right here in front of me. The rest of the committee was off to my right. And I asked him the following series of questions. On or about October 1st, 1963, inside the Russian embassy, a man identified himself as Lee Henry Oswald. There's a file that I had from the CIA. I guess they call it 203 files, I believe. 201 files. And there was a Lee Henry Oswald file. And I said, you reported to the Warren Commission that Lee Harvey Oswald was in Mexico City in the Russian embassy called the Cuban embassy, and he wanted to go to Moscow and he wanted to go to Havana. And he also asked for a Russian interpreter, which is interesting for someone who spoke fluent Russian if it was Lee Harvey Oswald. And he said, that's right. Then I showed him the telex that was sent out that day that had the photograph, as you know, of a different person. And the description on the telex, which was sent to all executive intelligence agencies worldwide, was indeed the description of the person who appeared, not the description of the historical Lee Harvey Oswald. So I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, the photograph equipment broke and we sent out the wrong photo. I said, okay, well, where is the tape? He said, we recycle our tapes every 6 to 7 days. So the tape doesn't exist? Is that what your testimony is? He said, yes. I said, well, why do you do that? Is that because of economies? And he said, well, we just sort of do those kinds of things. This is an agency that has a blank check. To this day, it still has a blank check. And I asked him if, rather than quibble about 6 or 7 days, what about November 1st? What would your testimony be? He said that it doesn't exist. And November 22nd and November 23rd, well, it was not in existence. I then looked at him, and he was staring at me, and I sort of have this effect on people when I question them in court, mostly defendants. I said, there are 3 people in this room who now know that you've committed perjury. You, me, Detective Fenton, who's standing off to the left. I'm going to give you a chance to purge yourself. And he stared at me and said nothing. I then asked Cliff to circulate the memo that I received from Mark Lane. And the memo states as follows in substance. It's from J. Edgar Hoover to all supervisorial personnel in the FBI worldwide, dated November 23rd, 1963. And it states that our agents, 7 of them, who have been questioning Lee Harvey Oswald for the past 17 hours, keep in mind this is a pre-Miranda case, who have questioned him for the past 17 hours, have listened to the tape made by the individual on or about October 1st, 1963, inside the Russian embassy in Mexico City, calling a Cuban embassy, and they can state categorically that the voice on the tape is not the voice of Lee Harvey Oswald. So he now read it. This is your chance. And in his, what we call demeanor evidence, appellate courts, Judge Wecht, do not have the benefit of demeanor evidence, do they? He looked at me, and I will give you the cleanest version I can, and that is to say that in his mind, his staring at me and my having the gall in his alleged mind to ask these questions of him would be the equivalent of him obliterating my presence. He simply folded up the document and he left the room. At which point, one of the members of the committee said, why didn't we get this document before? I said, we're not playing that game. That's the game that was played with the Warren Commission. The very people who should have been queried about what happened, the FBI and the CIA and executive intelligence agencies, were the investigators. And we know that they had members like Alan Dulles and Jerry Ford, regrettably, who was reporting to the FBI. Dulles, of course, was still the embodiment, notwithstanding the fact he was fired by JFK, of the CIA. And I said, this is what we're going to do. In order, since we're not a grand jury, we should invite him back with a lawyer and tell him he's now committed contempt because he was subpoenaed and there are more questions to be asked, and he committed perjury. And try to have him absolve himself of that and tell us the truth. That's what this is about, isn't it? How naive am I? They remained silent. I had been asked by the committee, by the way, to speak to the 435 members of the House to get our funding. And after this meeting, we no longer had franking privileges. That is, we couldn't send out any mail. They cut our ability to have long-distance telephone calls, and they cut the pay of the staff. And I told the committee in no uncertain terms that I was going to go to Tip O'Neill and have a press conference and tell them that they invited us down to Washington to investigate this case, and now they've pressed the trapdoor button on everybody on the staff. If they don't want to have the committee, don't have it, but pay the people who are working. So the very person in large measure who deserves all the credit for creating this congressional committee is Mark Lane. And the very evidence that he gave me caused this committee, in my judgment, to crash. And what happened was I was called by the chair, Lou Stokes, who I never knew before, but we became lifelong friends thereafter. And he called me and said the following: Bob, can we have a talk? I said, sure, Lou. You want me to come to your office? Would you? And I go upstairs. And he's telling me about all the compromises that have to be made. I said, look, Lou, you're a better man than I couldn't serve here. That is to say, I could not conduct this kind of an investigation in this House. If you are not going to vote, and what the process is, the committee has to vote if someone has committed perjury and/or contempt before the Congress, and they submit it to the full House. And the House votes, majority rule, it goes to the D.C. Attorney General, the person who is the chief law enforcement officer in D.C. And then they decide to prosecute, given the nature of what the evidence is. So far in my lifetime, the only person that has happened to is Roger Clemens, a notorious criminal who was acquitted, by the way, after it was sent to the House, and he was so condemned, censured, on the very same evidence. Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense, who lied to the United States Senate about an alleged operation by North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin on August 2nd and August 9th, 1964, where he claimed that there was ships that fired upon American ships, and that was the inducing cause for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that got us very much involved in Vietnam. He lied. How do we know that? He said so. Was he ever brought forward? By the way, if someone were testifying about whether or not we should go to war, would it offend your common sense if I suggested to you that maybe you'd want to investigate whether or not there's corroboration for what that statement was? How difficult would it have been with the McNamara case to simply ask our commanders in the 5th Fleet and the 6th Fleet and so on, all the fleet commanders, what, if anything, happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? And the answer would have been nothing, because he made a joke of it. He joked that he meant General Giap, G-I-A-P, the leader of North Vietnam forces. And he asked Giap, what did happen that day? And Giap said nothing happened. And no one ever thought, to this day, this media we have in this country, to write the truth about what happened. The 59,000 kids are not here because someone lied to the Congress in large measure to establish the predicate. If there is a predicate for war, we need to corroborate it. We have to understand it involves our national interest. And as a last resort, we go to war. I'm taking my family, as a matter of fact, as a side note, to Normandy on the 70th anniversary. Just like I think this may be the last anniversary of this kind of a convocation, I think that Normandy on the 70th will be also the last time we'll have those veterans there. Now, when people ask me about what was the state of mind of Earl Warren, I refer them to the executive committee of the Warren Commission, wherein Earl Warren is greeted by wagging a car. This happened about the third week in January '64. And in the third week of January, the following transcribed hearing. Wagging a car, the Attorney General of Texas, Leon Jaworski, his chief counsel, who 10 years later would be involved on the Watergate as chief counsel, and Henry Wade, the DA of Dallas, went to see the Chief Justice. Of course, the Chief Justice never should have accepted his job because of the separation of powers. What kind of trial do you think Lee Harvey Oswald would have had in America if the Chief Justice essentially constructively indicted him and said, this is the man who murdered the president and he acted alone. This is the chief rabbi, the head kahuna here of the judiciary, another co-equal branch of government. Nevertheless, wagging a car states with Wade that they have from unimpeachable sources, their term, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a contract employee for the CIA and for the FBI. And the Chief Justice says, well, we'll investigate that. Not so fast, says Alan Dulles. And what do you mean, says the Chief Justice? Well, Dulles says, J. Edgar Hoover's already upset with us because we're investigating this case. And if asked, he'll simply say that Oswald had nothing to do with the FBI. And the Chief Justice says, you mean to tell me that if we swear in an agent that he will lie under oath? Dulles, in black and white, in testimony before the Chief Justice, says if he's a good agent, he will. And the Chief Justice says, well, who will he tell the truth to? Maybe the president. And what happened was I told Lou Stokes that if the committee is going to do nothing, which I expect they will, that he has my resignation, and I'm going to speak with Dick Sprague, who was in Philadelphia. And I told Dick to come down, that the curtain had come down. And particularly after speaking to the membership of the House. And I met with most of the three, the complement of the House. I met with, for example, Jim Wright in his office, who was a majority leader. And this is the kind of interplay that occurred very briefly. He was sitting back in his chair, and I always had staff people. I needed witnesses to at least meet with the members of the House of Representatives. And he was sitting back in his chair like so, with his foot up on the desk. And here I am in the majority leader's office, on the other side of the desk. And I said to him, we need the funding because we're very close to dealing with the anti-Castro-Cuban CIA connection to this case. And we've run down the track of various other theories about evidentiary of who may be involved and who's not. And that included organized crime, and included LBJ, and so on and so forth. And he thrust his body at me, like so. We were nose to nose. I just sat there watching this. He said, you mean to tell me that Sirhan was involved with the anti-Castro-Cubans in the CIA? Keep in mind, this was a front-page story because the CIA had assets in the major newspapers. They went after Sprague. They tried to destroy his reputation. And he said to me that Sirhan, he thought I was telling him. Of course, I never mentioned Sirhan. I said, well, you know, I said to him, I think this is part of the problem about the funding issue. He said, what do you mean? I said, you see, we're not investigating the assassination of Senator Kennedy of New York. We're investigating the assassination of the president. Oh, he said. Oh. I then left. Dick Sprague came down to my office in Washington. I told him what happened, about everything. And he said, what do you think we should do? I said, we're going to resign. I said, he said, okay. I called up Lou Stokes. I said, get the committee together. Dick and I are going to resign. He got a good percentage of the committee. And there were some very good people on this committee. Richardson Pryor from North Carolina. Yvonne Burke, who, by the way, is from L.A. And Yvonne was on the Intelligence Committee and gave a blank check to the CIA. It was just done. You argue it, you know, you're not going to get along. Forget about dealing with the truth and what should be done. And they said, why are you going to resign? I said, it's very simple. I made a decision a long time ago in my life that my search for truth would never be compromised. Might not always find it, but we would do everything, I would do everything in search of it. And I don't want to be part of a historical investigation that is insincere and is a fraud. This whole thing's a sham. What you need to do is probably get somebody who you're going to hire, let him write a report, and just wipe your hands of it and go on to your next case. At which point they said, well, if Sprague, I'm getting the hook here from Ben. This happens to me in court all the time, Judge. They carry me out during summation. I'm not done, you know. I'm not done. And typical Washington about power and doing everything for your resume. Forget principle. Forget integrity. What do they see when they look at themselves in the mirror, if anything? Here I am. I told Sprague we're quitting. I had nowhere to go. I'm married. I had a young daughter. I had no job. And they said to me, and Chris Dodd was then a congressman on the committee, and he said, and Lou Stokes said, we want you to be chief counsel. And Dick said, yeah, take my job. I said, do you think for 1 second that I would live the rest of my life thinking I became chief counsel because I told you to resign? Is that what this is about here? You don't get it. None of you. You're not doing what you promised the American people you would do. And I'm not going to be part of it. And we left. Dick left that night. Cliff Fenton drove him back to Philly. I waited for the transition. And during the transition, I can tell you that if I put this in a novel, you would not believe it. I met with my successor, who has a book. It's like a loose leaf thing. And it's entitled, How to Investigate a Murder Case. And in it, it has, you know, mens rea, actus reus. This is first-year criminal law stuff, like the first week. And you're going through all your Latin to figure maybe this guy's really going to start talking, you know, in Catholic Mass in original voice. Who knows? And he has means, opportunity, method. And he shows me this. I said, have you ever tried a case in your life? He said, no. I said, well, this is a great case to bite your teeth on, you know. I said, and do yourself a favor. How many other people have you shown this book to? He said, why? I said, because this should be entitled Homicide for Dummies. And if you show it to anybody, they will know that you're a dummy who knows about trying cases. And what did he do? He got involved with a CIA guy he claims he didn't know, who started writing a report. They haven't investigated anything, and they never called Phillips back. So he just walked out on the committee. And what Mark Lane started, and the evidence he gave to the committee, which was vital, would it offend common sense to suggest that if the CIA knew that there was a phony Oswald 6 to 7 weeks before the assassination of the president, that you'd want to question them about who was involved with that and call every member of the organization in under oath? As long as it took to find and get every document. I said we would not accept redacted documents. Not only did my successor accept the redacted documents, but he couldn't even take notes from them. And believe me, when you investigate a murder case, notwithstanding the two extraordinary individuals, Martin Luther King and President Kennedy, it's a murder case. And whether you love Kennedy or not, or you love King or not, is irrelevant when you search for truth. There are no sources and methods in these documents. And yet, There are people who do not understand, they don't even understand it today, regrettably, that this tripartite, co-equal branch of government is meaningful. And I agree with Mark Lane when he talked about the greatest generation. Hamilton and Jefferson and Adams, Washington. They gave their lives, their sacred honor, and their fortunes for freedom. And that's what we're about. Freedom. If the DNA of America is about freedom, and the institutions of government have to respond to the needs of the people. And that's why I left Washington. And I never looked back. And that's all I have to say about that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sure, yeah, absolutely.
There we go. We can take a question or two, perhaps. We're on a pretty tight schedule. One second. I want to try to get attendee questions first. If there are none, Joan, you're up. Okay, you're up.
Wait. I just happened this morning to be given an HSCA document which describes the names of the people that they were interested in, and there are 3 Oswald names. Oswald Alexei, Oswald, I can't even, just give me a chance. Oswald Alexei Harvey, and then Oswald, I won't read the whole, Henry. And next to the Oswald Henry is a T, and the letter T means true name. So you're absolutely right about that file.
Thank you very much, Joan, for giving me a good grade. When you talked about Jewish intellectual women, I grew up with my mother, who was my school teacher, a Jewish intellectual, had me walking precincts for Adlai Stevenson. The only precincts he carried in '52 were mine in Brooklyn. That was it. Yes, sir.
My specialty is kind of the medical evidence. And when you study the medical evidence, you come across this amazing coincidence that the HSCA Forensic Pathology Panel was made up of colleagues of Dr. Russell Fisher, whose findings they were supposed to be reviewing. His 2 closest colleagues were Dr. Charles Petty and Dr. Werner Spitz, and they both ended up on the panel reviewing his findings. And I wanted to know how that happened. I know that you were involved in hiring Dr. Bodden. Was Dr. Bodden given the full leeway to hire his own people, or was he instructed to hire people that were supposed to bring a balanced view on the medical evidence?
Thank you for asking that. Mike Bodden I've known for many, many, many years when I was in the DA's office. He was I wear my glasses because I can't see very well, you see, so I will now take them off, and not trying to be Jack Nicholson, Jr. I knew Mike because he was Deputy Chief Medical Examiner in the city of New York, and the medical examiner's office was under the legendary Milton Halpern, who was the chief ME. And I worked with both Dr. Halpern and with Mike Bodden. Mike was assigned to Manhattan, New York County. As you know, the city of New York is made up of 5 counties. Each borough is a county, and they have a DA in each borough. So Brooklyn is Kings County, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island is Richmond County. And the medical examiner's office is one office, and they service all 5 of the counties. And Mike, I would meet with once a week, particularly when I was running the Homicide Bureau, and we would go over all the cases. Then, when I went to Washington, I told Mike to get the best forensic people in the country. And I didn't, it was totally my trust in him to do it. But the only person I told him to make sure was on the panel was Dr. Cyril Wecht, who I did not know, I had never met. But from my research on the committee at that point, I knew what Cyril was about, and I wanted his opinion at the table. When I was still at the committee, I will tell you this. I had a demonstration for the entire staff. Bob Groden knows this because he was a participant in what happened. We broke down the Zapruder film frame by frame. My chief assistant, Kenny Klein, was sitting as Kennedy, and Mike was then narrating the shots. When I was there, the shots, according to Mike, came from the front and the side. And when I left, things radically changed. Too bad. But that's what happened. I also want to very briefly mention something about Richard Helms. And that is to say the following. I got a call from Dan Rather. I did not want to have a press conference when I left. I didn't want this to be about me. After all, the committee could have still done, performed their duties after I left. I'm just one person. I'm fungible. They come and go. And I didn't want to have a press conference, and I told Dick no press conference. Let this committee go forward, and it's not something we're going to get involved in thereafter. And I was asked by Dan Rather at the 30th anniversary in '93 to go to the grassy knoll. I said no. I had not done anything with respect to it. That was from his assistants. Then he called me. He said, "Why won't you come?" I said, "Look, I don't want to waste the time going there. It's going to be up and back. I'll wait." But he said, "I guarantee you, we'll pick you up at the airport. We'll take you to the knoll area. I'll question you, and we'll take you right back." I said, "Fine." I go there, and there was a filming going on with Richard Helms, where I was being held for a few moments. And the following was asked and answered of Helms by a producer. And for once, there was a follow-up question. Instead of asking the question, you see this all the time with the president. They ask the question, then he goes to a filibuster answer. Everybody's exhausted from the answer, and there's no follow-up. And if there is, I dare you insult me to ask a follow-up. Instead of welcoming the give and take. And so the producer said to Helms, there are a lot of people believe that the CIA was involved in the assassination of the president. And he said, that's ridiculous. And the producer said, thank God, well, why do you say that? And he said, because when I learned that the president was assassinated, I checked to find out where all my agents were. Think about this. I worked in a high capacity in the district attorney's office. I started as the lowest of the low. And I'm working with the district attorney of New York County. And the mayor is shot and killed, hypothetically, God forbid. In the hypothetical, accept it, don't challenge it. And someone asked the district attorney, how do you know your people weren't involved? Because I checked to find out where my guys and women were. Where is the media on this? Where is the concern about searching for truth? My God, I've used my time. God bless.
Okay, for those who want to continue following the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Dan Hardway, who was an investigator for the committee, is here. He's going to be speaking specifically about his attempts to gather information from the CIA, some of which you heard about here. Dan was doing a lot of that legwork. He's going to be speaking in the Africa room momentarily, within the next few minutes. Here, we're going to be hearing from Jim Lassar in a minute. I'm going to introduce Jim in a minute. In the meantime, I want to just close up this particular segment of the program with a very special audio clip. I had planned to play this before, but I forgot to do it. As some of you know, or all of you know from our programs, within the last year or so, we lost a truly valuable investigator and journalist by the name of Gayton Fonzie. And Gayton wrote a great book called The Last Investigation, which was one of the books that really got me interested in the case personally. Gayton's widow, Marie, asked me if I would play this, and I said absolutely. So if we can cue that up, we're just going to hear the words of Gayton Fonzie. And there may be two versions of that clip on that thumb drive. Well, yeah. Okay. In the meantime, let me just say this. We have run out of programs, and we have some new registrants coming tomorrow. If anyone has an extra program that they do not need, please leave it with the ladies at the counter, or myself for that matter. We would appreciate that. Is that? There's nothing on that thumb drive for that particular clip. Okay, we have it here on campus. We're going to play it at some point. In the meantime, is Marie here right now? Is Marie here? We just wanted to say thank you for Gaten, and thank you for coming up here. And we will play that clip. I'll have to get them a fresh file. Something happened in the transmission there. I have the cassette also. I didn't think we'd have a cassette player here. Maybe we do. That'll be the low-tech solution. Okay. So we're going to be moving along now. In the early 90s, as you know, the Assassination Records Collection Act was passed and enacted, I should say, and the Assassination Records Review Board was created. The Assassination Records Review Board did a lot of good work. There are questions whether they did enough work. What did we learn from them? We've asked Jim Lessar. Jim, as you know, is the founder and president of the Assassination Archive and Research Center in Washington, and a prominent FOIA, Freedom of Information Act attorney specializing in matters relating to the JFK and Martin Luther King cases. Jim Lessar.
Good afternoon. In 1991, Oliver Stone produced the JFK movie, and it had the largest impact on American disclosure law that any law has ever had. The impact came because Stone had included as a tagline to his movie the fact that the Kennedy assassination records were being held secret until the year 2039. That occasioned an enormous outpouring to Congress. I've been told that it was the largest response that Congress had ever received on any subject. And that set in motion the process of enacting the JFK Act. That ultimately produced the Assassination Records Review Board, which was the enforcement arm of the JFK Act. Before I get into the JFK Act and a very preliminary evaluation of what it had accomplished and what it failed to accomplish, I would like to sketch a bit of the history of American disclosure law. I think that you need that in order to properly evaluate the accomplishments of the Assassination Records Review Board. There are a number of phases to into the history of American disclosure law. And basically, they reveal a continuing struggle between the concept of disclosing government information and suppressing it. In the latter case, the forces that are favoring suppression of the information are closely attached to the national security state that has developed since the end of World War II. The first phase is simple and the longest phase. The Constitution was enacted in 1789. It provided for a First Amendment right that you could not restrict freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And logically, you could extend that to the receipt of government information, because your speech is really limited if you do not have access to government records, particularly with after the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the growth of the state, the federal system of government. But the theoretical basis for requiring the disclosure of government information was laid early on by James Madison, and I have his quote here somewhere. Essentially, it is that knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who intend to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. A popular government without access to information, to popular information or the means of acquiring it, is a prologue to a tragedy or a farce or perhaps both. But for over a century and a half, there was essentially no disclosure law in the United States. Then in 1946, the Congress passed the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946, and it included a provision that was very nebulous and limited, basically a records housekeeping statute that was also proved unenforceable. The second thing that happened the following year was the passage of the National Security Act of 1947. And that contained the power to protect against the disclosure of intelligence sources and methods. A phrase that has come to mean, with the aid of interpretation by the Supreme Court, the ability to protect anything that the CIA decides is an intelligence source or method. By its nature, when you set up an intelligence agency, you are going to want access to media in particular. You want access to all kinds of sources, and particularly to those in the media. And there is a symbiotic relationship which develops between the media and the government intelligence agencies. The media curry favor with government agencies to gain information, and the government agencies then exploit that in a variety of ways. So the passage of the National Security Act set a very dangerous precedent, combined with the power to conduct operations and the power to protect intelligence sources and methods, with no right of access by citizens to question those powers. You had essentially set up a system in which you could commit a political assassination and the roots of it could never be uncovered. That was the phase of American disclosure law from 1947 until the passage of the Freedom of Information Act in 1966. In 1966, citing the quote that I just gave you from James Madison, Congress passed the Freedom of Information Act. It was a unique law in a number of respects, and its author, as a practical standpoint, was Bernard Fensterwald, Bud Fensterwald, who later became deeply involved in the investigation of the Kennedy assassination and other political assassinations. The Freedom of Information Act was novel in several respects. One, it provided that any person could have access to government records, and any person meant anyone in the world, a sweeping proposition that only someone like Bud Fensterwald could imagine. I'm surprised that it became the law. It's not restricted to citizens. It doesn't exclude permanent residents. A person in a yurt in Mongolia could make a FOIA request. Unfortunately, the law was passed in July 4, 1966, became effective July 7, 1967. It passed in 66, became effective in 67. It soon ran into troubles. The agencies resisted it totally. The courts would not enforce it, and it quickly languished. And a Kennedy assassination researcher who led the way in FOIA litigation for a couple of decades, Harold Weisberg, was one of the first to use the Act. And he was successful in some respects, even under the original Act, getting access to records on the King assassination, some of them, a limited amount, getting access to the Warren Commission executive session transcript, the January 27, 1964 Warren Commission executive transcript, which revealed that Dulles said that the CIA would lie about whether or not Oswald was an agent. But on the whole, the act soon ran into troubles, and it was the Kennedy assassination issue that led to a crisis and the demise of the original FOIA. Weisberg had filed a lawsuit. Bud Fensterwald was the lead counsel. I assisted him a bit. And that suit was for the spectrographic analyses on the Kennedy assassination. The suit actually landed in the court of Judge Sirica, Maximum John Sirica, who later became famous because he got Watergate reopened on the basis of Bud Fensterwald's representation of James McCord. The spectral lawsuit, Maximum John Sirica threw the case out, saying that it was not in the interest of the United States to reveal the records. The FBI had filed a declaration in the court saying that the heavens would fall, law enforcement would collapse if the FBI lab results on the testing of the bullets in the Kennedy assassination were revealed to the public. We appealed. On appeal, we initially won a victory, but that was reversed by the Court of Appeals sitting en banc in a 9-1 decision in which Weisberg was referred to as some party off the street who had had the gumption to ask for records. And the final passage of Judge Danaher's opinion in the en banc decision. Danaher had been the dissenting judge in the panel decision, but he wrote the majority opinion and said that as to plaintiffs' proposed further inquiry into the assassination of President Kennedy, Kennedy's assassination, the law forfends against this, and then he concluded his opinion in all capital letters, requiescat in pace, rest in peace. There was an attempt to appeal to the Supreme Court. Only one justice wanted to grant certiorari in the case, Justice William O. Douglas. But at that time, this occurred at the time that Watergate was breaking open, and the Congress, and there was another development which related to national security law, and that is that the Congresswoman Patsy Mink had requested the results of the nuclear testing at Amchitka, Alaska. And the Supreme Court ruled that and the government had cited Exemption 1, which is the exemption protecting classified information. And the government said that if a government agent had stamped a document classified, that was the end of the question, the end of the matter. You couldn't do any more than that. And the Supreme Court upheld that, saying it didn't matter whether or not a mistake had been made or the decision was actually corrupt. If the government said it was classified, and that was the end of the matter. That and the Watergate environment led the Congress to seek to amend the Freedom of Information Act. And it was really Exemption 1, the national security exemption, that caused the act to be amended. But what happened during the process as the bill to amend Exemption 1 was being debated on the Senate floor is that Senator Hart of Michigan had introduced it. Senator Ted Kennedy asked Senator Hart whether or not his amendment, Senator Hart introduced an amendment to the bill to amend Exemption 7. Exemption 7 is what had been relied upon, which to protect investigatory files compiled for law enforcement purposes. And that had been used to shut down the attempt to get the spectrographic results. Senator Kennedy rose and asked Senator Hart whether or not that amendment would override the Weisberg decision and 3 other cases subsequent to Weisberg that had effectively ended the Freedom of Information Act. It was, for all purposes, dead after the Weisberg case. Senator Hart said, yes, it will. And Senator Kennedy said, in that case, I support it. So with the support of Senator Kennedy and Senator Hart, the bill became the amended Freedom of Information Act, effective February 19, 1975. The amendments were important in several respects. First of all, it amended Exemption 1, which dealt with national security classified information. The problem is that, and the Exemption 7 amendment restored the ability to get files from law enforcement agencies such as the FBI. That was exceedingly important, of course, for the Kennedy assassination and other political cases. And a considerable amount of information began to be released as a result of the 1974 amendments. But ironically, the decision to amend Exemption 1, which was the main thing Congress had been concerned about, has, ever since 1974, been very seldom used. And while you can't say that the decisions on classified information are rubber stamps of the government anymore, they are still overwhelmingly in favor of the government and overwhelmingly deferential to the government, in violation of what I think was the clear intent of Congress in passing the amendments. As a result of the 74 amendments, however, records did begin to become available related to the assassination of President Kennedy. There were significant successes. The spectrographic records were obtained, those that could be located and were said to exist and found. That process was very time-consuming and took several years, but eventually at least some records on the spectrograph, in fact a considerable number of records responsive to that request, were found. And as a result of Weisberg's lawsuits and lawsuits brought by Mark Allen, there were probably a couple 100,000 pages at least released by the FBI and the CIA prior to the enactment of the JFK Act. But the basic problem was that while you could get some records under the amended FOIA, they were heavily redacted. Vast amounts of materials were being withheld. And this came to the head when the JFK Act was passed in 1992. And the JFK Act was a really remarkable development in the history of open disclosure in America. It was the first, it changed the very concept of how a government was supposed to respond to declassifying information or releasing information in any document. The Freedom of Information Act had been based on the concept that information was either exempt or not. And although there were some exceptions, the tendency was that if it was found to be exempt, it was exempt forever. The JFK Act changed that concept fundamentally. All information was ultimately to be released. It could be postponed for a period of time, but ultimately all of it had to be released by the year 2017, except for a few documents, a very few documents, which would be permitted to be withheld until 2017. But everything else bore a presumption created by Congress that it would be disclosed promptly and that there would be a presumption of disclosure. And in terms of the scope of the Act, it applied not only to executive branch records, which was the limitation of the Freedom of Information Act, but it applied to congressional records as well. So you got access to the House Select Committee records, the records of the Church Committee, and the Pike Committee, the Rockefeller Commission, and so forth. Another very important thing, the amount of material that could be withheld was much different. There was very liberal, it's the most liberal disclosure law that I know of in terms of what must be released. And in charge of this process, the JFK Act created the Assassination Records Review Board, the AARB, or the Review Board. And that in itself was a novel development, because it was putting into the hands of ordinary citizens the power to declassify information, national security information. This was the panel of 5 citizens that had that power for a brief period of time. Well, several years, but so the JFK Act also included another very important provision. I omitted a phase in my outline here, which I referred to as the Empire Strikes Back phase. And I don't know whether anyone wants to make a guess as to what that dealt with. But In 1984, George Orwell's year, the CIA and the ACLU got in bed together and whomped up a law called, with perfect Orwellian title, the CIA Information Act of 1984. The purpose of the CIA Information Act of 1984 was not to disclose information, it was to withhold it. And it did that by creating an operational files, an exemption for operational files. Operational files would no longer be subject to search under the Freedom of Information Act or review under the Freedom of Information Act. If it was an operational file, it was exempt. There were, however, three narrow exceptions to that provision. And they have seldom been employed. But again, the Kennedy assassination came to the fore, and they were applied in the case of Jefferson Morley versus the Central Intelligence Agency. And in that case, we were successful in getting the Court of Appeals to rule that the records on George Joannides had to be searched. And as a result, a couple of thousand pages of records pertaining to Joannides were released. Now, the history, and this is a success of the JFK Act and a success of the Assassination Records Review Board, because the records that the existence of Joannides had been concealed, and the records. Well, first let me backtrack. Most of you probably know, but some of you may not, that George Joannides had been the case officer for the DRE, the Cuban Student Directorate, which Oswald had been in contact with in the months prior to the assassination of President Kennedy. And that information had been concealed from the Warren Commission, the Church Committee, and when the House Select Committee on Assassinations began to ask after those records, the CIA brought out of retirement a case officer, George Joannides, and placed him in as the liaison with the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Neither Joannides nor the CIA told the House Select Committee that George Joannides was the guy they were looking for to answer questions about who had been the case officer for the DRE. They didn't provide records relating to the relationship between Oswald and the DRE. So they left, they misled Congress. They fundamentally subverted the Congressional Committee trying to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. This is one of the most important results of the JFK Act, because it means that the last official investigation to probe the assassination of President Kennedy was subverted by an agency that itself was under investigation. Professor G. Robert Blakey has, in filings he made in the Morley case, denounced this, saying that it was a violation not only of the House Select Committee's agreement with the CIA, in their memorandum of understanding, but also was a violation of criminal law. So that is one of the most important successes of the review board. Another extremely important success was the disclosure of Operation Northwoods. This, of course, is the operation agreed to by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and their leader, General Lemnitzer, which drew up plans very reminiscent of those on September 11th, to include terrorist activities, shooting people in the streets of Washington, D.C. and Miami, shooting refugees in boats flying from Cuba, hijacking planes, all in order to foment a case for invasion of Cuba. There were other important successes of the review board. It's widely publicized that the collection now holds around 5 million pages of records, the JFK Act collection at the National Archives. That's a little misleading in the terms of what the work that the review board actually did, I think. I think a fairly sizable number of those records, at least a few 100,000 of them, had already been made available under the Freedom of Information Act, although generally in pretty redacted state. And a lot of them were duplicate copies, but it's still a very impressive achievement. They got a lot of stuff out, and importantly, they did what no court had been able to do, what no congressional committee had been able to do. They got classified information, very sensitive classified information, out to the public. The information released included all kinds of very sensitive materials, code names, pseudonyms, cryptonyms, CIA stations, information that the intelligence agencies for decades had resisted, generally successfully, from being released by anyone, either court or congressional committee. It came out in a huge volume. And much of the time that has passed since the passage of the JFK Act and the process of releasing these records began has been devoted by researchers to trying to assimilate that vast repository of information. And we're seeing the results of it now in book after book, which contains new revelations about what the government did. There were other things that the review board did that were also important. It got medical records released and the medical record clarified. as to the failings or deficiencies of the Assassination Records Review Board, that's a bit more complicated of a question. There are some that are clearly, there's some things that are obvious, and some of them are admitted in their final report. They didn't get ONI records they should have gotten. They didn't. The Secret Service destroyed relevant records. They didn't get White House communication tapes. Now, not all of this is necessarily the fault of the review board. The agencies continued, some of them particularly continued to put up obstacles of various kinds. But still, while I have to say that the review board did an outstanding job in many respects, and in terms of the historical comparison, it is at the maximum of what it has been able to achieve through legislation to get access to government records. There are a couple of things that are particularly troubling. And one of them, of course, is whether or not the review board lived up to the basic commitment of the JFK Act. The basic commitment was that they were going to get all records out promptly, and they were going to do this to end the climate of distrust that Americans had towards the government on the issue of the Kennedy assassination. And they were going to reassure the public and restore that confidence. The problem is that that hasn't occurred to the degree that it should have occurred. We now know, as a result of the Morley lawsuit, that the CIA has been withholding until 2017 and perhaps beyond, although it is supposed to by 2017, absent personal approval by the President of the United States, to release all records. It has been withholding 1,171 documents that are JFK Act documents. The exact number of pages is not known. There is some reason to believe that it may be as many as 50,000 pages. That was a figure that I elicited from the Deputy Archivist of the United States when I questioned him at a public forum on the plan to declassify 400 million pages of historical records. He said that approximately 1% of the JFK Act collection remained withheld. But the National Archives is now not giving and appears to be unable to give a figure as to exactly how many pages are involved. They do, and in their response to a petition that some of us made to the archivist a couple years ago to expedite the release of the remaining withheld documents prior to the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's assassination, the National Archives denied that request. And they have, the suggestion is out there that that these records are of minor importance anyway, which of course belies the fact that they're being withheld until 2017, the maximum period of time you would sort of expect that those of the most sensitivity would be the ones, and potential importance would be the ones that would be withheld the longest. And it's also clear that from further probing that some of those, first of all, those records were classified as NBR records. NBR standing for not believed relevant. Some of the ones that are being withheld deal with E. Howard Hunt, the Cuban Revolutionary Council, NOCINCO. Now, on the face of it, those are highly relevant to JFK assassination inquiry. They're certainly within the basic statutory definition of a JFK assassination related record, because they were requested by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. That put them under the congressional definition of the term within the scope of records that should have been reprocessed and released under the JFK Act. It is possible, of course, that that there are materials there that are not of importance but got labeled NBR and withheld until 2017. We can't be sure at this point, not having seen the documents. And there are, in any large investigation, there's always the possibility of records that are not related to the subject matter of the investigation getting included. There's a famous example of this in terms of Warren Commission records, in which the Warren Commission withheld the dental charts of Jack Ruby's grandmother. They released the records of Jack Ruby's grandmother. And as Mark Lane commented, the dental charts of Jack Ruby's grandmother would not have been relevant even if Oswald had been charged with biting Jack Ruby to death. Or Jack Ruby had been charged with biting Oswald to death. Time is up. 10 minutes. Okay. All right. A second area that is of extreme importance is the failure of the review board, I think, to apply a proper standard in terms of defining assassination-related records. And the scope of the term, which was intended to be broad, and they held hearings on the definition, and they did provide a very broad definition of assassination-related records. But there are problems here, particularly as applies to the church committee records. First, there are church committee records which were within that term and apparently were designated as JFK assassination-related records, which have not been provided. And that is a prime source of concern that needs to be addressed. Secondly, the scope of the definition of JFK assassination records as it was applied to the church committee, and I think to other bodies of records as well, was, I think, unduly limited. On the face of it, they did conduct an investigation of church committee records to determine what records were related to the JFK assassination. But that, I think, was misguided. On the face of it, the political assassinations of Lumumba and Trujillo and DM and the others that were the subject of the church committee report were possibly related to the JFK assassination. They may, for example, have involved the same agents. We know, for example, that David Phillips was involved in the Allende operation. We now know, despite the church committee's finding to the contrary, that the situation regarding the Lumumba assassination was more complicated and less exculpatory of the CIA than the church committee made out. That possibility exists with respect to each of those assassinations, I think, and all of those records should be made available. Anyway, I think my time is up, except maybe for some questions. Oh, Ben left. Pardon? Anyway, are there any questions? And first, my eyesight is very bad, and I cannot see people, so you're just going to have to talk. Dan? Or who?
Hello? Yeah, got it. Jim, what happened to the 2039 date for the Warren Commission releases?
Well, that was wiped out. Well, first of all, that date was hypothetical. It wasn't really in effect, is my recollection. But the Warren Commission records were basically almost all made available back in the 1960s as a result of a very unusual development that shows that sometimes citizens can have a big impact even in places of power. When the Warren initial controversy over the withholding of the Warren Commission records for 75 years came to the front in 65-66. Mayor H.L. Johnson of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, no relation to President Lyndon Johnson, wrote a stinging letter, very brief, a page, or just basically a page, a stinging letter saying that he could not believe the Warren report unless the records were released. That got handed over to McGeorge Bundy, who made inquiries of the various agencies about the reasons for withholding the records, and resulted ultimately in a directive from the White House to the agencies, from McGeorge Bundy to the agencies, to release the Warren Commission records. And in a very short period of time, all but about a couple of percent were released. The rest of them, I think, have basically all been released as a result of the JFK Act. I don't know whether Malcolm Blunt is here or not. He's far more the expert on this than I am, and it's conceivable there's some out there that I haven't heard about, but basically they're out. Yes.
I may have missed one point in your summation of the history of the law of the Freedom of Information. Did you or did you not, or putting aside whether you said it, if you did, I missed it. Is it simply flat out illegal to destroy records?
well, it's not flat out legal to destroy records per se. If there is a pending Freedom of Information Act request, then yes, I think it's illegal. Now,
well, of course, the great majority of all documents are not covered by a pending FOIA request.
Yes. No, that's quite the case. Yes.
The case I'm thinking of is when Richard Nixon removed Richard Helms as the director of the CIA. I think he and his secretary, Helms and his secretary, spent about a week writing thousands and thousands of documents.
Yes.
Apparently a fully legal thing to do.
Yes. Well, let me hesitate a bit on that and say that it would depend on something I'm not sure I know the answer to at this point, but there is a record, there is a provision of the National Records Act. The National Archives is supposed to review all records that are going to be destroyed and pass judgment on whether or not they should be preserved for posterity. Now, a lot of that authority is delegated to the agencies. And in fact, back in the 1980s, a major controversy over this arose because it developed that the FBI, for example, had been destroying thousands upon thousands of pages without doing any historical review, and the
famous J. Edgar Hoover files, right?
No, that doesn't apply to them. That's a different issue. This issue came up as a result of the American Friends lawsuit against Webster, the FBI director. And it resulted in a 900-page report detailing the practices of the FBI into when and how they destroyed records, and a new set of standards was issued to govern the keeping of historical records. However, I read that 900-page report and found that I was not satisfied with it, and I have since become aware that there are a huge amount of FBI records that are being destroyed that I think should be preserved for historical reasons. It's a major problem that the National Archives has not addressed and Congress has not addressed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm afraid we're out of time, but we're out of time. But thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
I think that audio clip we can play. Okay, we're going to try this again. Marie and everyone, through the miracles of modern technology. Let's see.
In 1976, more than a decade after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and long after a majority of Americans had decided they didn't believe the Warren Commission report, the United States Congress announced it was going to conduct a full and complete investigation. Congress lied. Congress said that its new investigation would be more impartial than the Warren Commission's, would examine with unbiased finality every piece of evidence, and would explore the possible involvement of every individual or group with the means and motivation to kill the president. Congress lied. Congress said that its probe would debunk all the wild theories and crazy speculations that had sprouted over the years, and that it would confront all the unanswered questions surrounding the mystery of the assassination. Congress lied. And the leaders of Congress's new investigation said that it would definitely be the last investigation. That finally was the truth. I believe there will never be another official government investigation of President Kennedy's assassination. In my heart, that's very difficult for me to accept. And I will undoubtedly continue to support efforts to reopen the Kennedy case if those efforts could lead to a truly complete and honest investigation. Considering the political realities, I don't see that happening.
The late Gaten Fonzi, I was hoping the clip ended on a more positive note, but let's hope that his last sentiment is proven wrong. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and we'll begin our panel discussion.
Working around the clock to catch up was Robert Groden. And are you here, Robert Groden? Let's give him a round of applause for the work that he's done in this case. I just want you to keep in mind when I talk about the ethics of investigation that my background out of law school, the only reason I went to law school was to work in the office of District Attorney Frank Hogan and to try the worst of the worst and work my way up, ultimately to be selected to get into the Homicide Bureau, which is the major leagues of this whole business. And when I met Bob Groden, he got all of these pieces together. And I had worked with the very best detectives in the city of New York. And I wish I had, in retrospect, Gary Aguilar and Joan Mellon on my staff, and we would have ended corruption in New York City, given their expertise and diligence and comprehensive and thorough investigation. And Groden, the same thing. And we worked and worked, and finally it sunk in about all the different aspects of all this. But there was, what was critical in my training was that this was a search for truth under the rules of evidence. And that there is no Republican, there's no Democrat way to investigate a case. And there's no liberal or conservative way to evaluate evidence. So I also, before I get into what really happened in Washington, which was shocking to me, because I'm just a Jewish kid who grew up in Brooklyn and played ball and dribbled my way out to Berkeley and lived with traditional American values. And part of those values, which was a very big part of JFK, we've heard a lot about speculation about what he may have done or may not have done, but we know what he said. And it had to do with American exceptionalism. It's not some arrogant superiority concept. What it is a moral and spiritual way of life. And it came to America with the Puritans, who saw themselves as the children of Israel in the Old Testament, who fled oppression, who took a perilous journey across the vast ocean, and who believed that they came to the Promised Land and that we would be judged. They would be judged as moral beings. And so it was John Winthrop in about 1630, who was the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who said, "We are this city on the hill." It wasn't Ronald Reagan. We have a tendency to believe as soon as a new president is elected, history starts on that date. But his people were smart enough at least to go back in time and recognize that we are the city on the hill. And the conflict in America has always been, and continues to be, how do we act in concert with the mind of America? And that's where the reform comes in, and that's why we need a chief executive who's completely independent, like JFK, who got burnt in the Bay of Pigs, recognized after he dismissed Dulles that he had to revamp this whole intelligence apparatus, because what the bottom line is, which we clearly learned and knew basically ultimately, is trustworthy and relevant, and no appellate court will reverse the case from the trial record. When and the other book that I was asked to do an introduction to was Dr. Crenshaw's book, which they have now retitled, I understand. But I do want to leave you with this thought about that. Dr. Charles Crenshaw was in Trauma Room 1, as most of you may know, when the president's body was wheeled in to Parkland Hospital. Dr. Crenshaw is a renowned trauma surgeon. And Dr. Crenshaw indicated that the wounds came from the front and the right side. This is before there was a one-bullet theory. This is before there was a Warren Commission. And there was that kind of evidence that I thought would be very important to present to the committee, because if people want to know, when people say the Warren Commission didn't do a fair and honest job, you have to ask them, why wasn't Crenshaw called before the Warren Commission? That's what you would, if you had the theory, which they did regrettably, that is to say the Warren Commission worked from conclusion backwards. In the course of conducting investigations, the facts take you to conclusion. The evidence, legally admissible evidence, take you to conclusion. Warren Commission did exactly the reverse. And that's exactly what should not happen, because as I was telling our committee members, we are not a grand jury. And we want to present all sides. So if you work from conclusion back, the Warren Commission, particularly with Earl Warren, formerly DA of Alameda County, Attorney General of California, Governor of California, he knows about exculpatory evidence. He's responsible for Brady v. Maryland. And that exculpatory evidence is any evidence that would show that the accused is not guilty. That's a serious burden on prosecutors. It's not something you wait to give them at the last second, 10 seconds before summation. You give it at the earliest opportunity, because we want to exonerate the unjustly accused. There's a big inventory in criminal justice. You don't have to worry that you have no work to do. So the whole Charles Crenshaw thing, to me, is a prime example. And what I remember very distinctly when I first came to Washington, and I'm a Johnny-come-lately to all this, because the only book that I ever read prior to going to Washington was Mark Lane's book, only because I knew of Mark Lane. And that was 1966, Rush to Judgment. So the Crenshaw piece, though, which was very revealing to me, was a diagram he made in circular fashion, indicating that the back of the president's head was blown out. And various people signed on to that. And yet it was ignored. It was ignored by the Warren Commission and ignored by the media. Now, when I went to Washington, I was very impressed by some of the people who were there. And I think that the most impressive person I met in Washington, who I literally drove crazy, having him show me film after film, frame by frame, before we started, but we learned from the evidence that the executive intelligence agencies define national interest, and that the elective process is a temporary thing, isn't it? Some people are elected to Congress for 2 years, the Senate for 6, the President for 8, maybe. But they're there to keep and define and maintain what they find as our national interest. So there's a conflict between the President and the Executive Intelligence Agency, then you have this tension. And to show you how hard we worked at the committee, I was called in one day by Bob Grodin's assistants, and they said, you have to see this film, it's very important. And I went into the room, and it wasn't a video room, it was just a room. And there was a screen, and the camera went on. And there was JFK. It was a 1960 West Virginia primary. And he was dressed there in his Brooks Brothers suit. He had on cashmere muffler and coat, his wingtip shoes. And it was a real moment to show that he was a people's person, not just the junior senator from Massachusetts who was the son of a rich man. And so he was greeting the coal miners. And it had just rained, and it was drizzling, and he was on the mud flats, and he was shaking hands with the coal miners in anticipation of this West Virginia primary that was conducted by Matt Reese, who was his campaign person then, who I met when I ran my boss's last campaign while I still was trying murder cases, only working after 6 o'clock at night. And one of the coal miners stopped right in front of JFK, and he said, as Kennedy extended his hand, he said, "Senator, I understand you haven't worked a day in your life." And Kennedy immediately glanced to see if anybody heard that, and everybody in the media had stopped. Kennedy looked at him and said, "I guess you can say that's true." To which the coal miner responded, "Senator, I want to tell you something. You're not missing a goddamn thing." Now, the reason I mention American exceptionalism, and the part of American exceptionalism, is we try to institutionalize virtue, and we recognize that evil exists. It has to be confronted and defeated. And the reason I mention that to you is not only to tell you where I'm coming from, and you will evaluate what I have to say about what happened at the committee, but JFK said it in his inaugural address, and I urge you to read it. Because what he said was he took up all of the Puritan exceptionalist claims. He talked about how the rights of individuals come from the hand of God and not from legislative or executive fiat. He talked about how this torch is going to be passed and it will light up the universe. He talked always in moral terms. And he talked about that we will be doing God's work here. And that's when he went into that famous refrain of, "We will bear any burden, endure any hardship, and make any sacrifice to assure that the blessings of liberty are here at home and around the world." That was the JFK that I knew. And when he, what the ethics are of it, and how do you conduct an investigation, regardless where you may be. As an assistant DA, I will tell you, in Manhattan, I worked in an apolitical office, if you can believe that. My boss was Frank Hogan, and he was a lifelong Democrat, but always had a liberal party. That's the party of David Dubinsky of the International Lady Garment Workers. John Lindsay ran as a liberal and was elected mayor. The Conservative Party and the Republican Party. He didn't know the political affiliations. And so the only thing that we were concerned about was a search for truth. And if the major issue that we were always concerned about was to exonerate the unjustly accused. And in the kind of trials, high-profile trials that I had, lasting 5 months, 10 months, major murder cases, I spent a good part of the trial, particularly in summation, in debunking the big lie, defense. There's an old saw around the court, and it goes something like this. If you have a weak case on the facts, try the law. If you have a weak case on the law, try the facts. If you have a weak case on the law and the facts, you try the DA. When I came to Washington, I realized, after investigating the case and coming up with some very, very important evidence, I now had the big lie offense to deal with that was pursued by the government, that Oswald acted alone without foreign intervention. I can tell you from my experiences, having tried several hundred cases to verdict and being responsible for thousands of cases as head of the criminal courts and running the Homicide Bureau, that I don't believe there's any courtroom in America where Oswald would have been convicted on the evidence that was presented before the Warren Commission. I also wanted to make mention of my dear friend Mark Lane. I was very honored when he asked me to do an introduction to his book, which is entitled The Last Word. And I wish you'd all read it. Isn't that nice that I could tell you to read other authors? And the amazing thing about Mark Lane is that I knew of Mark Lane when I was in the DA's office. When he was an assemblyman, I was in high school. And when I came into the DA's office right out of law school from Berkeley, college and law school at Berkeley, that was pre-revolutionary Berkeley, revolutionary Berkeley, and post-revolutionary Berkeley. Mark Lane was the scourge of DAs. And I try to explain to everybody that you want to try cases against the very best defense attorneys. Why? Because it's not about the win. It's about ensuring that in the case, justice is done, and you never want to win a case, have it reversed because of some faulty error that never should have been made. And Mark Lane, you should pray that you try a case against Mark Lane, who will press the government so that the evidence
November 22nd marked the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's assassination. Coming up, more from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh and a conference disputing the U.S. government's official findings on JFK's murder. Next, Robert Tenenbaum, the former Deputy Chief Counsel of the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations. He gives his analysis of the government's conduct in the investigation of President Kennedy's death. He's followed by James Lesser, president of the Assassination Archives and Research Center, who gives his assessment of the job done by the Assassination Records Review Board, which issued its final report in 1998. This is 2 Hours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ben. And thank you for all attending. I just wanted to, by way of introductory remarks, sort of tie some things up, because Joan Mellon gave a great talk this morning, and she talked about how the president has sort of surrendered to the CIA, which JFK did not do. JFK was going to appoint Bobby Kennedy as head of the CIA and reform it, which was a major issue in this whole investigation. But then last night, a gentleman from the Boston Globe talked about how the media covers matters of national security. And between the two, Joan, of course, is right. If the media were covering national security, and let me put it another way, if all of the researchers who you've heard, all of the authorities, were to focus on getting the truth today, how much better off would our society be? Benghazi as a very quick example. Administration knew in real time what was happening on September 11, 2012, which was a Tuesday. They then didn't tell us the truth. They talked about it being a spontaneous demonstration as a result of a video which not too many people ever saw. And then the president, with the Secretary of State, 3 days later at Andrews Air Force Base, with the parents of the deceased, who were flag draped in coffins, looked at them eye to eye, ear to ear, nose to nose, and said, we're going to get the people responsible who made this video. And so the question arises, which is Shakespearean, and that is, to express an unfelt sorrow is the office which the false man does easy. So again, when we talk about the media allegedly covering national security, I would suggest they would start with the issues today, because if the IRS is indeed focusing on conservative groups and they get away with it, tomorrow it'll be liberal groups. And in a month it'll be independents. And there'll be nowhere to hide. And that aspect I mentioned because it's so much part of the investigation